Hey, let's get started. It's a real pleasure today to host this webinar on navigating the EU AI Act. I am Sanmi Koyejo, a co-founder of Virtue AI. I'm joined by Jan Eißfeldt. And embarrassingly, I realize I've never double checked that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but I think we'll get a chance for you to correct me in a minute. Who wears many hats, but among them, Global Head of Trust and Safety at Wikimedia Foundation. And the purpose of this webinar is to engage a bit in understanding some of the global policy and governance landscape that's evolving around generative AI. Jan is a global leader in thinking about trust and safety and how it engages in AI governance. And this is, we think, incredible opportunity for us to learn a bit about how this regulatory and policy and governance landscape will intersect with generative AI. And towards the end, we'll talk a bit about Virtue AI's perspective specifically on some of these questions. We're also joined by Eric Sun, who's a product manager at Virtue AI, and who will also be helping us both engage in some of the content, but also at the end talk through some of the questions that come in on the Q&A. So, all through the conversation, please, as you hear some of what we have to say, as questions come to your mind, please feel free to jump in and ask some of the questions. I'm going to stop sharing screen because our plan today is much more conversational than presentation. And I'll start off by asking Yan to maybe introduce yourself as you prefer to be introduced. Maybe teach us the correct pronunciation of your name. And then we'd love to dive into some of the EUA Act and also some of the policy and governance things. But let's just start off with some introduction.
Yeah, thank you kindly. I'm Jan Eißfeldt. Pleasure to meet all of you. I tinker with loads and loads of things, and here comes the inevitable disclaimer. Everything that I will be saying in the following is not the institutional view of any of the entities I'm affiliated with, including the Santa Fe Institute, the foundation, and all the rest of it. I'm dealing with loads of AI issues globally, as well as other platform governance and compliance issues and a wide range of public policy related items. And I'm very excited to talk about what will probably be at the center of a lot of investment decisions in the next 36 months for basically everybody in Silicon Valley and beyond.
A great start. So, Jan, what is the EOA Act, and which corporations care about this? Why should corporations care about the EOA Act?
Very good question. So it comes in two flavors, really. First, there's a whole pile of things that the European Union, or to put it differently, the largest highly monetizable consumer market that's accessible to US and generally non-Chinese corporations, cares about and wants you to do. That is true if you're an AI or a broader tech company, but it's also true if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare and finance. Basically anything that can touch upon consumers, but also if you're a natural person who does that for professional purposes, if you're, for example, a sole service provider as an independent contractor, wants you to do. More importantly, though, it also does something that the United States Congress is currently thinking about, which is it avoids having, in the European Union case, 27 different rule books that you would have to comply with in order to do business across their single market, just like Congress currently thinking about putting down in the big Republican bill a provision that says all those 50 states shall not make their own rules. Whether or not that would be constitutional, I would defer to US attorneys about. But that's essentially the idea because a lot of states have been doing a lot of work putting their own rules out in the United States context. And there are, I think, 550 bills in front of different state houses at the moment. So that's essentially the broader landscape. And last but not least, the European Union has a habit of being really good, and we have seen this with prior pieces of legislation in exporting its legislation to other jurisdictions. So it's not only that you get access to the European market if you're following that rule book, it's also basically everybody who has what's called the dynamic alignment trade deal with the European Union, and they're the only really large economy on the planet that still signs these things regularly. So if you're trying to do business with Singapore as of last week because they signed a new trade deal, or South Korea or Japan or Brazil, or probably by the end of the year, India. If you're doing the European thing, you're mostly good for most other markets as well.
That's great. That's helpful in understanding the landscape. You touched on something there I'd love to expand on a little bit. So, I'm a US company. Let's assume you're large-ish and have a international presence, but also maybe if you're, mid-size. I think what I heard you say, and I wanted to maybe expand a bit, is this question of one, if I'm going to sell into the European market, I should care about the EUA Act, but also if I'm a US company, what's my interest? Why should I care about, these folks across the pond making legislation around generative AI?
So you have some internal, very concrete human interest in this. The larger your accessible market, the better your valuation multiples for your equity. That's true if you're VC funded, because VCs care about how large your potential market is, but also if you're publicly traded naturally, because, right, if you're putting a lot of money into infrastructure and then you don't get your money back, it's not great for your long-term valuation horizon, which impacts, among other things, your own compensation as a senior executive. Beyond that, something that's quite important to recognize is when the European Union puts out a rule book, the first people who usually copy and paste it as a base for their own legislative efforts is the State House in California. So even if you're saying, yep, I have a US only domestic kind of focus, more often than not, you will have to do a lot of this work anyway, because California, which, if you look at other consumer-facing industries as well, it usually sets the rules for the US market more broadly, tends to use it as a basis and then basically bolt on a couple of extra things that are important for California politics. So
Helpful.
there's no escape.
Indeed. So, whether or not, one is ready or prepared, the compliance infrastructure is likely to be one that will be important uh, globally, but also increasingly within specific markets and specifically within the US. And again, maybe starting off with the states, likely there'll be national aspects of this over time as well. Maybe we can dig in a little bit. So, my understanding of the EU AI Act is that it thinks of the governance framing in terms of risks. And I wonder if you could walk us through something about the risk framework, what levels of risk, how maybe, again, companies should be thinking about the risk thresholds and where they engage in that landscape.
Yeah, I will focus on things that organizational decision makers need to know. I don't think the audience needs necessarily, page 512, subsection 3, that kind of thing. So, long story short, the European Union, having learned from the GDPR, the DSA, and the DMA, Digital Services and Market Act, respectively, which they also just rolled out, has figured out that technology is moving. And we don't necessarily want a legalistic approach to saying, oh, you have to do this and that, like they use with banking regulation, but instead wants outcomes, good societal outcomes, ideally. So they figured out, and I think rightly so, that a risk lens is the smartest way of compelling the industry to do what they want in broad societal terms, while giving the companies a lot of agency and freedom in figuring out how to do that. So there's a quite dynamic regulatory framework. It starts out on the top with things they just don't want, usually for societal reasons, what's called unacceptable risks. That's, for example, Chinese-style social scoring applications. They don't want anything to do with that, and the Europeans, naturally, largely for national security reasons from their point of view, are big on manipulative AI. So if your product is particularly and intentionally designed to manipulate the behavior of users in the European single market, even if you're not yourself in the European single market, but they can access your product, then you're having a real problem with the AI Act. After that, the bulk of the entire thing, both in terms of size as well as regulatory impact, with those fines up to 7% of your global revenue, is high risk applications that are largely in the, oh, if you want to do something like selling to the public sector in terms of judiciary, law enforcement, but also certain regulated industries. So they're dealing with that in the high risk bucket. There is a smaller section on most of the things that you would think about in the business to business context, that are not dealing with actual data of consumers, for example, but mostly trade secrets issues of this nature. That's usually fine, and it's relatively lightweight in terms of the obligations. So the obligations are tailored to the risk buckets. And then last but not least, minimal or basically unregulated issues is your very basic chatbot having Q&A with also public documentation with the same answers of the questions that you have in customer services context, for example. Important to note, there are two interesting aspects here that they have built in that are probably of interest for C-levels in particular. One, if you're a really small company, or what the Europeans call a small, medium-sized enterprise, there's a whole list of metrics how you figure that one out. You don't have to do certain things under the Act that larger corporations have to do. And then on the other end, European regulators, for reasons largely of industrial policy, love end-to-end open models. So if you're end-to-end open and you are not systemic risk, both in terms of your distribution as well as the severity of your use case, then you are also essentially reduced to have good technical documentation that's publicly available and have a summary statement of where you got your data from.
Now, this is great. Could you say a bit, I think you started to touch on this, but there are a bunch of different stakeholders that engage with the Act. And so I think I understand there are folks who are sort of foundation model companies. There are folks who are deployers of AI systems that are users themselves that engage in the systems. How does the Act separate out the different stakeholders and their responsibilities in this sort of larger governance scheme?
Yeah, most of the obligations are on what the Act calls providers, which is legalese in Brussels for people who actually build models or build services. So even if it's not necessarily your foundational model, but let's say you have agentic AI that you're putting on top of a foundational model, that would most certainly qualify as what they call a provider. And therefore, you're on the hook with good technical documentation and whatever additional obligations you have based on how severe your legally acceptable, non-acceptable risk use case you got. Below that is what they call users. And that's not the end user that we think about in the context of being in business, but it's essentially people who take foundational models or who take services and then deploy them in other contexts. So, for example, if you're a bank and you buy outside AI capabilities from a vendor, that makes you a user who's also on the hook for certain obligations. It's important to note in who is basically policing you in that regard, that the European Commission is not doing the reasonably messy start of the GDPR, where they did the act and then they gave it to national regulators, or in Germany's case, 17 different regulators to basically all figure out themselves what they do. These days, the ability to play off regulators against each other has really been shrinking because since the Digital Services Act, the Commission basically is the core regulator. And then they have something, the Germans have a lovely word for that, but put that aside, a orchestra or symphony of regulators, where they bring these people together in usually physical spaces at least once a month to make sure that Ireland is doing what France is okay with and Portugal is doing what Poland can live with. So there's a quite holistic approach to these issues.
This is super helpful. So I think better understanding stakeholders, this is great. Better understanding what the act itself is designed to do and some of its context risk thresholds. I wonder if you can help us contextualize the act in the context of, governance more broadly, historical precedent. Now, I understand that, for instance, you mentioned briefly the DSA or DMA. I wonder if you can engage a bit in what is similar about the UAI Act compared to, previous governance legislation? How do we think about this as different? How should folks who may or may not be familiar, or let's assume they're familiar, how should they think about this as relevant to some of their previous experiences with European regulation and governance?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that are pretty constant, a couple of things that are different. Let's start with the similarities. Probably the most important similarity is we iterate on what we're trying to do with pushing the technological progress forward and the services that we build on that for industrial purposes. And they continue to iterate how they regulate and what the regulatory act says. So this is a moving landscape. The quite common in the United States idea that, okay, once a decade, they pass an act, or maybe once every 20 years, and then everybody fights over what that statutory language says for the next 30 is not how this works in the European context. They continuously iterate in this regard. And the AI Act's own creation is a good example thereof, because just like the other pieces of legislation that I noted, they made meaningful changes halfway through. In the AI Act's case, for example, ChatGPT came along in the final negotiations for the AI Act, and they opened a whole additional section to make sure that they were up to date on that. And other issues that are staying the same is so the enforcement will look structurally pretty much comparable to how the Digital Services Act looks like, meaning Brussels sits in the center. They have created what's called a new artificial intelligence office that reports into the president of the European Commission, packed with technocrats. Quite a number of people that used to be in AI in the Valley have been migrating over there recently because the commission, which has its own office in San Francisco, actually went out to industry and said, hey, we're going to do this thing. Help us figure out how to enforce it in a sensible manner. So there's some technological understanding actually behind that in this case. And then they have this concert of regulators with which they want it together. So this looks like the Digital Services Act. It also means it looks different from the Digital Market Act, for which, under the Digital Services Act designated, very large online platforms are the only applicants. In that regard, we can expect continuous iteration. We can expect reasonably harmonious enforcement. And last but not least, it also means that the start of enforcement, while harmonious on the substance, reasonably speaking, will be uneven in when it starts and who are the initial targets. So if you think about the GDPR, for example, the French were really, really fast out of the gate. Essentially, they started cases the day the law came into effect, just doing preliminary work, hunting for potential targets within their own jurisdiction. And the moment they could apply the act, they started issuing fines, while other jurisdictions, notably Ireland, used to be somewhat more relaxed. There will be a little bit of that, but it's probably less than what we have seen with prior acts, just because they do this now the fourth time, and if you do things repeatedly, you get better at it.
That completely makes sense to me. Um, I'm reflecting a bit on why we chose, some of the timeliness of this conversation. So my understanding is that there's a major deadline coming up pretty soon in August. And I'm curious, for companies who are maybe early in this journey thinking about compliance, do you have a sense of prioritization? What would you say that they should put as the absolute top of their list for the next, say, 60 to 90 days, to be best placed to sort of answer the call of EUA governance?
It starts probably out with getting all your key decision makers in your organization, which, if you're the sole founder, might just be you and potentially two or three board members. Or if you're somewhat more mature, your senior technical leadership and potentially general counsel in case you have in-house counsel, on the same page, that the do we have to do this conversation is out of the way before you do it. That's step one. That usually saves a lot of trouble for you down the road, in my experience, specifically with organizations who do this for the first time. Second, have a pretty clear idea from your corporate strategy point of view about two things. First, how important is it for us to have frictionless compliance? Meaning, you're the founder or C team, as well as your key engineering resources, are really scarce. And if you are setting up a system where you build your thing and then you're trying to figure out how to make it compliant, you are wasting a lot of your time, which means the scarcest resources of your organization. So think about whether the way you're building your products is optimized for the least friction way of complying. And that sets you usually up for success, not only internally in getting the stuff out of the door and getting it to market, but also, and this is important and quite different from, say, half a decade ago, it sets you up better in terms of your competition. Sometimes us in the valley think about, oh, we built this thing, and if external markets don't want to buy it, you know, they don't buy it. But what has changed, and especially changed since DeepSeek, is, well, they have other options, right? So I've talked to quite some decision makers, not only in Europe, but also in Asia Pacific, about their general expectations, which and this has a lot of social, cultural preferences underpinning it in different markets, are usually quite aligned, at least in certain areas, with what the Europeans are trying to do. And say, well, if the Americans don't give me the kind of compliance that I want, I just buy from the Chinese. They're cheaper anyway. And, China being the most heavily regulated high-tech market on planet Earth, they don't have a conversation with you whether or not they have to comply. They just say, okay, how much compliance do you want?
That's an interesting pivot there. I wonder if I can, one part of this is again how technology purchasing might happen based on who might supply what. But maybe I can engage in this from a strategy perspective. So, many companies who are either operating globally or would like to operate globally now have to face different regulatory frameworks. We're focusing in this conversation in EU, but there's the EU, there'll be something likely probably at the state level in the US across different states, maybe something national. As you've already alluded to, sort of, there are different regulatory frameworks in Asia where many of these are being either worked on, announcing soon or recently. How would you think about this? Is again a strategic question, but I know you have some sense of this. I wonder if I could pick your brain a bit. How companies should think about designing across different markets. So, should they be thinking about, hey, I want to build a single solution that engages with all of the different regulatory platforms or regulatory perspectives? I think you alluded a bit to this as maybe a reasonable strategy at the beginning of the conversation, as one of the reasons why U.S. companies should be thinking about the EU. But I think there's a broader strategy question of, again, there'll be different regulatory conversations across different parts of the global landscape. And this balancing act does sound tricky to me. And I'm curious if you have any, I think already you've given us great nuggets of wisdom, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on this idea of balancing across regulatory perspectives globally.
Yeah, it comes in three flavors, really. I mean, three key strategic things that you need to work out for yourself as you're trying to scale your company on a global level. One is, and here I start distinguishing between if you're B2B or B2B C versus B2C, essentially. If your customers are corporations who themselves are, subject to laws and they have their own compliance obligations in their market, say Singapore or Japan, etc., it is essentially best to take of your key strategic markets in terms of your internal capital expenditure, but also in terms of minimizing the amount of time you have to deal with regulatory stakeholders, and by extension, very important for your brand value if you're consumer facing, for example, your public relations obligations and if you're publicly traded investor relations. The highest level of compliance in terms of covering most of the areas reasonably well from your key markets, which, as I said, usually is the European Union, unless you're in mainland China, just because, right, largest accessible, highly monetizable market. And then you can iterate downwards from there, which is a lot cheaper than trying to build 27, 40, 140, depending how much your international footprint looks like, different iterations. It's not a great secret, I think, if you're thinking about this from a practical point of view, if you think about the Online Safety Act in the UK, for example, and the Digital Services Act in the European Union, that companies usually just do the infrastructure investment, meaning hiring people, setting up the processes for Digital Services Act. They do the adjustments and the documentation of the adjustments. report out for the DSA, then take the same report they just sent out to Brussels, copy and paste it into the different template that the Brits have, and just send it over to Ofcom. It cuts down significantly on the amount of time, most importantly, that you spend on these things. And that approach helps if you think, also not a great secret if you talk to people in Brussels. The VLOB, very large online platform that spent the most money on their first DSA audit, I think spent 45 million euros on just doing that one audit, which they have to do once a year. The least amount of money that was spent, just because you just did this thing that I just talked about, was three people working part-time on this for a couple of weeks. So depending how you set this up, which goes back to my broader point about your internal senior leadership alignment, makes a real difference whether you spend a ton of money or you are reasonably smooth in that regard. If you are B2C, then you have the additional component that a lot of this regulatory stuff is not so much only a cost of doing business. It has a lot to do with respecting the country and its value in the Indian context, most importantly, but also if you're doing business in East Asia, as well as the regulatory aspect. So if you're doing this reasonably well, you can save money on public relations and communications budgets, marketing budgets to a meaningful degree as well, especially in B2C, and can create quite a number of potentially positive press stories in the process, even while what you're actually trying to do is to just get your regulatory staff so that you can move forward with the mission of the company and the technical progress you're trying to deliver.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. In the conversation, you brought up this point about sort of one of the key components of, thinking through one's governance and policy infrastructure is this high risk classification, which ties a bit to stakeholder, but also ties a bit to sort of technology. I wonder if, we could dig in a bit and maybe an example of how a corporation or enterprise might get a sense of how they might determine whether their AI application might be high risk or not, particularly I think it gets really tricky in some ambiguous edge cases. But I also understand that there's some existing, say, compliance checkers and things like that that help engage with this question. I wonder if you could walk us through some of those ideas.
Of course. So if you are doing something really interesting at the edge of the industry at the moment, chances are you're in the higher risk bucket, just because that's usually how these things go, right? If it's novel and the Europeans have what they call the precautionary principle, meaning, let's figure out how to do these things. They do this for all industries that touch upon European consumers so they don't single out tech in special regard. You're usually in the higher risk bucket. The easiest way to figure out where you broadly are, and I will come to the caveats in a second here, is the European Commission is providing a preliminary risk checker that's on their website. You can go there. They ask you a bunch of questions. It usually takes 4, or if you are unfamiliar with it, 8 minutes to fill that in. So, not 50 pages or anything of this nature. And then they say, well, it looks like based on the information you have provided, you're in this bucket. Click here for what obligations might be. And here we come to the caveat. So one of the high risk applications, which is probably a good, interesting example, both for B2C as well as B2B use cases on a wide range of issues, is biometric data. Now, I'm putting the DSA aside here for a moment and American privacy laws by state. So the idea is, for example, you have a camera either because you have home security or an industrial manufacturing context, or if you are Meta, right, you try to stick cameras on people's faces. And you encounter other humans, so you scan their biometric data by virtue of recording their facial features, etc. So if you go to the website of the European Commission, it will say, if you type that in and that's your use case, well, under Article 5, this might actually be a banned use case. And I would recommend at that stage, either find yourself a qualified outsourcing compliance company that knows these things and can help you also sort out a lot of the other problems that I have noted in the run-up to these remarks, Or if you do have a lot of compliance in-house, or you have a small team, but that absolutely knows what they're doing, then you can go into the text, which, as I said, is complicated and there are different layers of it. But for the example I gave, biometric data, and you actually read the text, it says, well, it's banned biometric recording if you do it for law enforcement purposes. Of course, again, with exemptions for national security, blah, blah, blah. But if you do it for industrial purposes or for a wider range of purposes, it's not actually banned. And essentially, the thing moves out of the banned bucket into the high risk bucket. So being able to shape not only your product, but also how you think about your product strategically in the marketplace. Who are the customers you are serving? What is the purpose you are trying to fulfill for them? Has a meaningful impact on where you are on the risks of the AI Act and what your obligations are. There's a lot of things that you can do if, as I said, either you have an outside competent help to do that so you can focus on your technical service progress, or if you have the capacity in-house.
Makes a lot of sense. We've talked to, I wonder, thinking of people listening both in real time, but also maybe offline, engaging in this. I wonder how they should think of themselves differently as enterprises. In some sense, some of the conversation seems like it'll affect larger corporations much more obviously and much more in general than maybe startups. But I'm curious your take. Are there specific considerations? Are there maybe exemptions? Are there aspects of, again, this regulatory landscape that startups should think about differently than, the large corporation counterparts in terms of how to engage with, again, this emerging governance landscape?
Yes, there are aspects that are the same just because the environment of the industry that we are in has changed, and aspects that are radically different from each other. Let's start with what has really shifted. There are two things. Conversation I usually have with VCs who evaluate, how much money should I give at what multiple. First, this is the first technological paradigm, artificial intelligence, where we have not yet figured out as an industry how to make money before the regulators got here, right? So in the 20 plus years I've been in the industry, cloud computing, social media, you name it, mobile applications, etc. We always figured out, okay, what's the foundational business model of the industry and how do we make money? Who are the winners essentially that take the prize before regulators came and said, well, societal impact, blah, 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 which is still an ongoing conversation. With AI, we basically haven't yet figured out how to make money sustainably at scale, paying for that infrastructure, getting our investors' money back. But the regulators are already here. So this is a radical difference just on a strategic level that applies to all people in the marketplace. The other one that is also true for these particular two characteristics is this is the first technological cycle essentially since the Cold War. So, the very, very, very early stages of the internet being essentially a military academic application, where the security environment will shape a lot of what is expected to you on the regulatory side, but also in your relations with governments and your relationships with investors and the public. The security competition across the Pacific is already shaping AI, right? I referenced DeepSeek and what that did to US capital markets earlier this year. And it will continue to be, unlike CEO experience for the last 30 years, be a key part of what you're doing if you're running your own company or if you're a senior executive in an international company. So that's just two things that are staying the same, and the AI Act is a big piece of both of those dynamics in different regards. Now, differences. If you are a really large corporation, say if you're Microsoft or the Wikimedia Foundation by reach, that kind of thing, you're expected to be able to resource a lot of those compliance things, not only for highest standard, which usually is the European Union, but also for those things below, and to be able to articulate that, to deal with public relations issues in those different markets, etc. If you are smaller, say you're a startup and you have 3 people, you don't really have any revenue yet, that kind of thing. Your obligations are basically make sure you're setting yourself up for successful compliance down the road really, really early. This is not only a question of, well, it's the cost of doing business, but remember what I said about the Chinese being really happy to accommodate all these different preferences. If they're just offering this as part of the package and you have to go back to figure out how to do that, especially if you're in a regulated industry, say banking or healthcare or chemical industry, industrial applications, they just go with the other guy who has figured this stuff out because it's a confidence game. So it's also an issue of your competitiveness where you just have to train that muscle, which of course really large corporations have in-house. If you're looking for an example where all these things come together that is unfolding in public right now, have a look at what Microsoft just announced last week for their cloud computing strategy for Europe, where they have been bending over backwards to say, sovereign cloud, your new mistrust as European stakeholders in the United States is being mitigated by us spending $40 billion on new infrastructure in Europe. And we are storing our cloud computing code in Switzerland. So if we can no longer operate the thing, you can have the code. And we're outsourcing the actual operation of the infrastructure to think SAP in a French company or something like that. So these things all go together. If you're looking at the AI Act in particular, if you're really small, or even if you're bigger, but you're end-to-end open source, meaning your data is open source, your foundational model is open source, your firmware layer, application layer, all of stuff, that also goes together with their industrial policy, where if you're small, right, proportionality of enforcement is really important, and proportionality of regulatory burden is really important. So that's already in the act. But if you're looking out for, say, the next 18 months to 3 years, the Europeans in particular have also embarked on this new deregulatory push, which does not mean they're going to lift all of those burdens, but they will be tweaking, and I think they're reasonably transparent about that, how those burdens are applied. So if you are, for example, a small shop and you are relying on those external services of a dedicated provider, that they already know. And regulators, just like investors, love comparable metrics that's consistent in terms of the definition of an active user and all of that across the different players in the marketplace. Then they will probably just do the ticking exercise of the boxes, and you don't have to worry about actually spending any time engaging with any of those regulators in person. So it's a very time efficient kind of way of just outsourcing that, having a trusted intermediary. While if you're really complicated, you will have to spend a lot of time on that. And the bigger you are, especially under the Digital Market Act, they will also force you to separate out different AI application and service layers from other legacy core services that you might have, as well as how your different agentic AI services might be interacting with each other down the road. So the bigger you are, the more burdened you will be.
This is great. Jan, we're gonna pivot to audience questions in 5-ish minutes, but before that, what I thought I might do, and I wonder if you indulge me in this, is maybe spend a couple of minutes talking about Virtue AI and our engagement in this ecosystem and this marketplace. And I might engage you a bit in thinking through your sense of how we fit in the ecosystem to help again answer audience questions. And then I'll ask the audience, the folks listening. Again, this is in my view, a good opportunity to ask some questions. So we'll give a few minutes for you to think through some of the questions that you might have, so we can maybe go through them and see if we can help you be less uncertain, maybe, about this, again, upcoming governance and regulatory landscape. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about Virtue AI, and then we'll engage a bit in how it fits in the ecosystem. So Virtue AI is a company that prides itself in making it easy for enterprises to build in technology that allows for security and compliance within AI generative infrastructure. So we do this via currently 3 products that work together as a broad platform. So we enable both engaging in each of the products separately or thinking through the platform as a way to have a more holistic perspective on AI security and compliance. The three products, the first one is Virtue Red, which is built as a observability evaluation platform. So this is a tool that allows for you to scalably understand what the risk surface is of your generative AI system. We do this through a long history of technical work that allows us to build some quite specialized tools for algorithmic evaluation, what sometimes the security folk call red teaming. So this is the ability to understand the corners of your system and where the system might fail. And so this tool is both useful pre-deployment to understand where the system might have gaps, but also we found quite useful within the development pipeline for people to understand as they're making changes in generative AI systems, how those changes interact with, again, the risk surface and deployments of AI systems. Our second product is a Virtue Guard product. So this is a guardrail. This is meant to be deployed generally in real time. We built this tool again with lots of experience in the core technology to have quite low latency. So it's built so that it can be sort of real time attached to your generative AI system. The idea is, you get discoverability via the red system and via sort of engagement with customers, and you want to know how to protect your system against potential gaps. And so the guardrail system is really built to allow you to close this security compliance gap to real world deployment. So it allows for detection and mitigation of all kinds of issues that can show up in AI deployment systems, all the way from issues tied to things like fairness gaps, all the way to jailbreaks and security issues, all the way through all the other sort of kinds of failure modes. We have PII detection, we have hallucination detection. So all these kinds of gaps that can show up in deployments of AI systems. It's built to be multimodal, so it covers text, image, audio, video, and recently we've added code deployments in real time. So again, the idea is, no matter the modality that you're deploying AI system in, and in fact, we actually have even more sort of usefulness if you're doing multimodal AI systems that combine multiple modes together. This allows for a platform that can, again, give you this guardrail that allows for mitigation of issues as they show up. It's also worth saying that these systems are designed so that they can work well together. So, you discover the gaps using the red system, you mitigate the gaps using the guardrail system. This can be done as a standalone solution or sometimes as part of maybe internal retraining or other mitigation strategies in deploying your system. And then finally, I'll mention that we have a Virtue Agent system. So this is built so that if you're building agentic frameworks, so things that have the ability to have, within deployment ecosystems, actually take actions. This allows you to build on what we've learned from building red teaming and guardrails, but now in agentic settings. Yeah, and maybe a quick question tied to this before we move to the audience. So we've talked a bit about where Virtue Red fits, or Virtue broadly fits in, again, the sort of compliance ecosystem. We think of ourselves as giving customers the ability to understand the vulnerability and help sort of figure out where they need to patch their systems to be compliant with existing policies. And in fact, we have specific evaluation tied to policy compliance, and also the ability to take in both internal policies but existing external policies and sort of build compliance mechanisms tied to this. But I'm curious, your sense of where technological tools fit in a company like ours in this, again, this regulatory landscape, something like the EUA Act.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it actually starts earlier than the regulatory landscape, which is at the core of where the company value is created. I talked earlier about one of the first things you need to do after senior leadership alignment is have a look at how do you actually build your products. And the earlier you can think about those aspects, which then touch upon regulatory readiness, into the ideation process of your senior engineers, the better you are. What you show me here essentially enables to deliver those benefits quite early. And it also addresses the two other points that I made about regulators as well as investors really love having one report, not only consistent for the one company, but also with the same methodological underpinning across companies. So I think it's a pretty strong value proposition. And the last point that I would make, especially related to Virtue Guard, and virtual agent. If you're thinking about where we are going in terms of industrial progress, right? One of the big things that's coming up, Christmas sales 26, I suppose, is that we move user, especially consumer-facing AI and certain business-to-business applications in professional and manufacturing context, out of having the AI sitting in the dark in your mobile phone, not really knowing what this right now context of the user driving the application, interacting with the agents, having multimodal input is doing, right? Because, and you saw this in one of those lovely OpenAI presentations when they were trying to get the mobile phone to talk to the people on stage, but because it was laying on the table face down with the camera, it didn't really know what was going on. But what the new form factors on the hardware layer, Meta is doing this, and Google is rolling it out, I think, with AI glasses with Samsung later this year as well, is it enables a whole different layer of value propositions. So if you're thinking about not only ticking the boxes for what you have now, but enabling your technical teams to drive forward to where the industry is going, new form factors, new application layers. Your approach seems to be a lot better set up than what most vendors are showing me on occasion because they sort out one aspect or the other, and then you suddenly have 5, 10 different vendors that you have to juggle and they don't talk to each other. So none of those problems do you have. I think it sets you up pretty well.
Indeed. I think we pride ourselves on this customizability and sort of flexibility to the broad and evolving landscape. So I think that that's a helpful point to make. I'll maybe pause here. I think Eric has some questions from the audience, and maybe we'll try to answer some of those questions in a few minutes before the end of this.
Sounds good. Yeah, we have a question from David from the audience. Appreciate this question. Can you tell us a bit more about the upcoming deadline for answering the EU AI Act questions? What is the scope of these questions? What gotchas are there to look out for? And for a large enterprise with many AI-based tools, what might the scope be?
Understood. So I will take the questions in steps, and David, by all means, jump in case I'm missing a key part. The first thing is, so the AI Act is already in force. It will go into application, I think, August 2nd this year. And there is an additional deadline, which is essentially supervisory, which is the August after that. Now, there are a couple of things, especially if you're coming from a larger org, that are quite important. I noted earlier that different states will design in the European Union will assign different institutions to basically do this supervision in the concert of regulators with the Commission. So you can reasonably expect, while the questions are consistent, you can already try them out for the initial test at least on the website of the European Commission. They will have different, okay, I'm actually launching an investigation kind of timelines. If the DSA and the GDPR in particular are any guide, they're probably already doing some digging. Just because the statutory text is already there, they're already receiving consumer complaints. I'm not sure whether anybody in this room has ever filed a consumer concern with the European Commission. They have lovely reporting mechanisms on their website, but also, of course, get them managed up from national regulators. And they're pretty fast. So I've seen cases both on the software and the hardware layer where essentially the commission started looking into this within 3 days. And they learned from the GDPR to be pretty fast with these things. So even if you're thinking this is relatively far away, you can reasonably anticipate that they're already looking into certain things and that they will get going reasonably fast. Now, scope. It comes with being guided by those risks. So the questions that you can expect are questions that help them understand, how many participants do you have? What are you trying to deliver to those participants? Do you have This is a new aspect that historically wasn't very important, but is now quite important indeed. Some part of your infrastructure or some part of your service processing outside of the European Union, because data exports are becoming increasingly a hot topic in most countries. India, Vietnam, the United States to some degree, China, of course, traditionally, and the Europeans newly as well, are quite interested in some of this stuff. And then I think it's important to note, based on my experience at least, not only at the foundation, but in different contexts, the intention of those questions is usually not a gotcha question. It's, and this is probably different in the European Commission context than if you're engaging with national regulators to some degree, at least. A quite genuine discovery process of trying to understand what you are trying to do. To give you a practical example that was reasonably well publicized, the Digital Services Act has a metrics threshold for the highest level of burden, which is being a very large online platform. And that's 45 million active users in the European Union slash economic zone. And Wikipedia may or may not be falling under that. So we have this conversation, and it's usually important as not only to have situational awareness, but also deal with structural issues early on. So we looked at that act at the foundation and said, well, we don't actually have the analytics infrastructure to answer that question because while everybody in industry on the commercial side is really, really interested in active monthly users, the foundation is a charity. We don't really give a toss about how many people read Wikipedia articles. Don't quote me in front of my boss on that. But long story short, right, we don't have the analytics infrastructure, certainly not with the same methodological approach that big tech has, just because, right, Wall Street has certain expectations and the share price goes up and down with quarterly results based on what that number looks like. So we articulated it really early to the commission, right, because the questions are pretty transparent already on the website in this case as well as in that. And they were quite prepared to say, okay, what can you reasonably do with the infrastructure you have in order to still comply with the right good societal outcome, if you think about the beginning of our conversation, in order to get there. So there are more discovery questions and gotcha questions, which I know in a lot of jurisdictions is what you are reasonably expecting from a risk management process. Now, if you're a really large corporation, you use a lot of AI, not only Gen AI, but a wider range of applications. You can reasonably expect, especially if you're in a regulated industry, that it is safe to err on the side of you are in scope, as opposed to trying to minimize the amount of stuff that's in scope. There's a good economic reason for that. If you think about capital allocation and your balance sheet and operative expenditure, that may be helpful while I'm pointing this out, which is a lot of corporations spend a lot of money on cybersecurity insurance, especially, right? Where you're trying to move the risk of having a major cybersecurity incident off your balance sheet or off the performance of your C team over to an insurer. However, especially in the last couple of years, I think it has become quite apparent that doing some of these sensible, you got to have cybersecurity capabilities, you got to do red teaming, the kinds of things the AI Act is mandating. It's probably cheaper to actually have your house in order than trying to move the risk off your balance sheet. So my suspicion is if you're really large and you have a wide range of services, that actually taking as much as possible of your infrastructure and just run it through the compliance process, especially if you can outsource a lot of that process to a trusted vendor where you get those extra bonuses of having the same metrics as other people, etc., which is a credibility gain, compared to having a really expensive cybersecurity incident insurance, which, last point on that, usually doesn't pay anyway. So if you're looking at a lot of those policies, they have a lot of, oh, you have to do all these things. A lot of things the Act is also mandating. And then more often than not these days, they also say, and if you have done all of these things and you still had an incident, we pay you $1,000 per machine. And then they will haggle with you for 3 years over what constitutes a machine under the policy you bought in order to, cover all your bases.
Thanks, Jan. This, I think, excellent, and I think deep answers to the question. I'd also reflect over the whole conversation. I think I've learned a ton. I think the lots of great nuggets on how to think about, again, this new landscape, or at least this emerging regulatory landscape. Maybe not completely new. I think we've learned that from you a bit, but also thinking about how enterprises should be thinking about engaging at all sizes and at all scales. Wanted to end here and thank you again for engaging so deeply in this conversation and teaching us a ton. Oh, just want to check, if there's a 1 minute or something else to think about, we can do that. If not, have a bit of closing. But it sounds like I think we've covered most of what is, relevant and easy to cover in an hour conversation. But curious if there's anything, last thoughts before we close.
I think it's sensible to think about this as a business opportunity and enhancing your competitiveness as an organization, as that, especially but not only in relation to Chinese competitors in international markets, more than a compliance kind of exercise. And it will help you if you're looking at where the US domestic regulatory landscape is heading towards to also to build for the future on the domestic market if you're a US corporation. And thank you very much, especially to David for the question.
David, great question. And yeah, thank you for those last nuggets. I like the framing in terms of competitive advantage. I think that resonates strongly with also how we think about it. So I'll end here. Just wanted to share just quick snippets. If you're interested in any of the technology side of what we talked about and what Virtue offers, I'd encourage you to take a look at our website to get a sense of Virtue Guard, agents, guardrails, red teaming evaluation, and happy to have future conversations on that end. But otherwise, I think, again, excellent conversation, Yan. I think, again, deep insights. Thanks, Eric, for the organization and also some of the Q&A. I think we've covered most of what we plan to cover here. So we'll stop the webinar here and thank everyone again for engaging. It's been great.
Thank you kindly. It was a great pleasure. Thanks for having me and enjoy.